Okay, so today we want to talk about the critical period of weed control. That is the time when weeding should be done or when weed control should be done. So let me share with you this slide. Right, so we want to talk about critical period for weed control. What is it? This is what we wanted to define. Now, there are two stages in the crop life cycle when weeding should not be done. One of the questions which we may ask is, at what stage, at what crop stage should be the first weeding be done? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks, up to probably 6 weeks after crop emergence? When should we actually come in and do it so that we don't affect crop yields? That is the first question, which is addressing the timing of weeding. The other question is how long should weeding be done from the initial weeding? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks, follow up to probably 8 weeks? So the second question is addressing to the duration of weeding. So the first question is the timing of weeding. When should it be done? And the second is the duration. How long should we do it? Then these are actually addressing the critical period for weed control. So critical period for weed control, that is the period when weeding should be done. This was actually investigated firstly by Nieto et al. In 1968. And after him, there are now a lot of studies on a critical period for weed control. This was done in Mexico. So we have got two stages within the crop life cycle when weeds do not affect crop yield. Now, at first, when the crop is emerging, it is not sensitive to weed competition. Probably the crop is still using some carbohydrates from the seed reserves, and the root system is still localized. So it's not facing competition. Then there's another period at the end when the crop is almost reaching maturity, or when the crop is mature, it's no longer sensitive to the presence of the weeds. There could be weeds in the field, but they will not be affecting the crop. So it is this gap which is the critical period. So it is this gap that is when weeds should be removed in a crop. So the critical period for weed control, probably we can say that is the time when the weeds, sorry, it's when the crop is sensitive to weed competition. We have to correct this. This should be crop is when the crop is sensitive to weed. Competition. The time when the crop is sensitive to weed competition. So I'm going to use a graph to give you a picture about this critical period for weed control. Okay, let me. The y-axis weeks from, it could be weeks from planting. Let me just type it here. Maybe. Weeks from planting. The y-axis should be our crop yield. crop yield. Now on this graph, I am going to display two things. The first thing is that we wanted to find out what can happen to our crop yield as we delay weeding from probably crop emergence or from crop planting. So let me use probably a brown color, which is near to red, because it shows how dangerous it can be if we delay weeding. So I'll start from this point. At first, the crop is not sensitive to weeding, so our yields are not decreasing. Then gradually, the yields go down. They may not approach zero. So this graph is showing what can happen to yield as we delay weeding. Let us call it as it weedy period. Weedy period. This is showing what can happen to our yield as we delay weeding. And indeed, most experiments on delayed weeding show this typical graph. Then there's the other issue. Let's suppose we weed a crop and we allow that crop to be free of weeds. Let's say the crop is free of weeds for 1 week, 2 weeks, and we keep on increasing the weed-free periods. We want to see what can happen to our yield. This one I will show the response. Probably let us use a green color. If we start from here. Now, as we give the crop the weed-free period, the yield will start to increase. Maybe this is a bit too high. Right. So this one is now showing what can happen to yield as we give it the weed-free period, or as we free the crop from the weeds for, let's say, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and so on. So this is the weed-free period graph. Right. So we have got two graphs which are superimposed on each other. The weed period, that is when we delay weeding, and the weed-free period when we supply, when we make sure that the crop is free of weeds for given periods. Now, when we draw these graphs, you'll find that there's this gap here. That gap is what we call the critical period for weed control. I can use this mark here to draw the straight line here. And probably, right. So the gap here is the critical period. You can see at this point here, at the beginning of the, at emergence, crop yield is not affected. At maturity, crop yield is not affected. It's somewhere in between here where the crop is affected. That is the critical period for weed control. How we define it, we may take up to the limit to define it, or we may allow just say, let's say 5% yield loss. A yield loss of 5%. This could be from here up to that point. And we may draw a line. So this, sorry. So this gap here becomes our critical period. Critical period for weed control. Now, this period can vary from 2 weeks, six weeks. So this can be either 2 weeks, 3, 4, 5, up to 6 weeks, depending on the conditions. And we said this was firstly developed by NATO. NATO et al. In 1968. Right? And this has become an important model which can be used as a tool to manage weeds, or a tool for weed control. Because if we can identify this period in any crop, we will then know for how long we should control weeds in that crop. For interest, in tobacco in Zimbabwe, we had cousins, I think it was cousins, who established this kind of diagram for tobacco, which defines the periods when weeds should be removed in tobacco. I think he did these experiments at the Tobacco Research Board. I think around the 1970s or so. So even in other crops, we had the weed research team which did a lot of work in maize, soybean, across many crops, in fact, trying to establish the critical periods for weed control. Because once we know these periods, it means we will know, we can target our control at this period. Let's say we were using herbicides. It could be residual, with the residual effect when we apply the herbicide to the soil. There's no need for the herbicide to continue acting after the critical period. It will be unnecessary and also uneconomic. Even if when it comes to use of hand hose when weeding, there may be no point to weed beyond this period, this mark here, which you are seeing on the diagram. But of course, it is arguable that if we allow weeds to produce seed, then we are increasing the weed seed bank, etc. But for the current crop, we are not really improving yields. But for the long term, maybe one should continue weeding. It's another different issue altogether. So I just wanted to demonstrate to you this model, the critical period for weed control. I will now move on to the PowerPoint. So I will stop sharing this bit. So I'm now moving on to the PowerPoint. Yes, I now have it. So we were trying to define the critical period for weed control. You may as well appreciate that weeds have been a problem since many tried to produce his own food by growing crops. You could have heard this parable of the weeds, which can also demonstrate that the weeds issue has been a problem for a long time. But what is being advised in this parable of weeds is that there were people who had noticed the weeds emerging in a field. Then they asked their master or a boss whether they should actually remove these weeds. In fact, they were quite surprised because they had planted wheat only to find that there were other plants emerging, which it was not their intention. So they wanted to remove them, but their master actually advised them not to remove them, but to wait until the crop was mature. Then they would separate weeds from the crop. Now, with the weed competition, if you wait until the crop is mature, there may be nothing to harvest at the end. But of course, this is a different meaning. Now, the questions which we wanted to address is how long should war weeding be delayed before there is crop yield loss? Is it 1 week up to 6 weeks? Here, this question is addressing the timing of weeding. Then how long must be a crop be free of weeds to prevent crop yield loss? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe up to 8 weeks? This second question is addressing the duration of weed control or weeding. Now, these are some of the current weed control practices which can be done under smallholder farming environment, because they rely mostly on hand hoeing. Even if you were to go out into the fields, you are going to notice that there are some portions which were weeded at the wrong time, or you may find wrong places being weeded. In other areas, there could be too much weeding, unnecessary weeding. And the extreme cases is where no weeding was done at all. Now, if we focus on the life cycle of a crop, we can identify two periods. There's a period when weeds do not compete with the crop. That is the first few days after crop emergence, and also the days before the crop reaches maturity. Those are the points where weeds are not affecting your crop. Then there's also a period when weeds compete with the crop, and that could start from 2 weeks up to 6 weeks after crop emergence. That is what we are referring to as the critical period for weed control. That period which stretches from 2 weeks and ends at 6 weeks. So this could be an attempt to define the critical period for weed control. You may say it starts from the time when a delay in weed control results in significant crop yield losses. And it extends to the time when weed control does not result in significant effects in increasing crop yields. Or you could simply define it by drawing those graphs. So this is the graph which I was trying to explain, which define this critical period. We have got this, the red line. This time it's showing the weed-free period. The black line is showing the weedy period. And if we allow, well, here we allowed 10% to draw this straight line, which gives us this gap showing the critical period for weed control. We could even draw it right at the top and get a shorter critical period for weed control. Now, this is the model which can guide us in weed control, so that it becomes cost-effective to manage these weeds. And I indicated that Nieto et al. In 1968 were the first scientists to produce this model, and it is being used in weed management across various crops. This was produced by Thomas and Van Lindet in 1980, working with the soybeans. I think they did a study for 4 seasons This is the mean for 4 seasons, which is producing this graph. In this case, the critical period probably starts at 2 weeks and ends somewhere around the 4 weeks. Some may say probably it stretches up to 6 weeks. This is an example of treatments which are used to assess weed competition in the crops or to produce the critical period for weed control. You need 2 sets of treatments. You have in a weedy period, you need 0 where there are no weeds. Then you can allow your crop to compete with the weeds for 2, 4, 6, and probably 8 weeks, 8 weeks could be season long. Then we have got another set, weed-free period in weeks, where you've got 0 in this kind. In this case, there should be weeds throughout the season. That is 0 for weed-free. Then you can allow your weeds to be free of weeds just for 2 weeks, then 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and then 8 weeks. Then when you collect your data, this is how you can draw those 2 graphs, which can define the critical period for weed control. Now let us focus on some of the data which was collected in Zimbabwe to define the critical period for weed control. Now, this data suggests that in most cases, for our crops in Zimbabwe, the critical period for weed control starts from 2 weeks after crop emergence and extends to 6 weeks or 8 weeks after crop emergence. Later on, I will discuss what can affect this period when we actually try to implement it. Now, soybeans, Thomas and Van Lindet, estimated that period to be from 2 to 6 weeks. But we can generally apply this period, 2 to 6 weeks, in various crops. Well, in winter cereals, work was done for 4 seasons, and it was not established. This critical period for weed control was not established. It's simply because most of the weeds were being killed by frost in winter wheat. And this was happening in the high veld. But when we go to the low veld, maybe it's a different story. This is soybean crop infested with weeds. I don't know whether you can identify some of the soybean crops, but there are a lot of weeds in that crop. Now, here we wanted to discuss the factors which can affect this model. Because we said we may start weeding from 2 weeks and finish around 6 or 8 weeks after crop emergence, especially here in Zimbabwe. But there are other issues to consider when we apply this model for weed management. Remember, we can use it as a tool to manage weeds. One of the problems which we may face when using this critical period for weed control, number one is you can have weed seedling emergence before the crops, before the crop emerge. And weeds which emerge before the crops, these are very competitive. They are highly competitive. Weeds which also germinate with the crop are also highly competitive. So you've got weeds which can emerge before the crop, weeds which can emerge with the crop. These are very, very competitive weeds. Then the weeds which germinate after crop emergence, they are less competitive. Now let us look at how this model can be affected. Now, if weeds germinate before the crops, it means that this model is not going to work, because you need to control those weeds even if the crop has not emerged. Because if you allow those weeds to emerge, to exist before your crop emerges, straight away they will suffer competition, because the roots of the weeds will coincide with those of the crops, even if those roots are still young for the crops. This could, but if the weeds germinate with the crop, then our model is functional. We can use it to predict that period when we should come and weed. If the weeds germinate well after crop emergence, we may never detect this period. It means the weeds are not going to affect our crop. So this is how period of weed seedling emergence can influence this critical period. The second point is weed density. Now we know there's a minimum weed density which can affect crop yields. The one which we refer to as weed control thresholds. On the other hand, we know that if we increase weed density, we can decrease crop yields. So what you are saying is that below the weed control thresholds, the model is not sensitive to give us information on when to come and weed and when to stop weeding. Because at low densities, the assumption is that our weeds are not affecting our crop. But above the thresholds, I think this model will work very well. It will tell us when to come and weed, probably from 2 weeks. Then we end at 6 weeks. But of course, this may be debatable because the cousins thinks that as long as they are weeds, they will start damaging the crop. But as managers who are growing crops, we can allow a 5% yield loss. And if we give that 5% yield loss, then we will say that threshold is not really affecting our crop yields. So in that case, the model may not tell us really when to come and weed. Then the crop density, if we increase crop density, or there could be a certain optimum crop population which can decrease with the populations. So it's the crop density which can now affect this model. So there's a certain crop density which we think may allow us not to impose a lot of weed control regimes. So the model may not give us true information. Then with the species, again, the model can be affected by the number of weeds, number of weed species which exist in the field. For example, we have Rapoco grass versus the Mexican clover. Rapoco grass may be more competitive than Mexican clover. Pigweed may be more competitive than blackjack. The question is, does this model give us the same information for pigweed or for blackjack, for Rapoco grass or for Mexican clover? Maybe for Rapoco grass, we should come and weed the area compared to when we have a Mexican clover. Of course, this is debatable. Probably unless we do more research, we may never know the differences between blackjack and the pigweed or Rapoco grass and the Mexican clover. Maybe the crop species have got little impact on this model. Then the crop species and the varietal effects. Could we have some crops which tolerate weed competition? If there are crops which tolerate weed competition or even suppress weeds, then the model may not be telling us the truth, because maybe we don't need to do a lot of weeding. Here we've got barley, rye, wheat, and oat. They could suppress weeds in that order. So depending on which crop you are growing, the model could vary in giving us true information on when to come and weed. Soil and climate factors. Here we are concerned with the soil fertility. Under low nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, there could be serious competition for nutrients. So it may warrant us to come and do the initial weeding at 2 weeks, maybe end up at 6 weeks or 8 weeks. So under low soil fertility, yes, this model could give us useful information for weed management. Soil moisture. Under drought conditions, we think, again, this model is very helpful because probably we need to come and weed around 2 weeks after crop emergence. But during a wet season, the critical period, instead of starting at 2 weeks, it may be delayed and start at 8 weeks. For example, Thomas indicated that one could delay weeding in maize for up to 8 weeks without reducing crop yields. This was maize and chamber grass competition. Then soil pH. Low soil pH of around 4.2, 4.5, which is actually common in communal area soils. This may induce serious weed competition in maize. So this model may tell us really to come and weed from 2 weeks and probably finish around 6 or 8 weeks. So under these conditions, the model could be very useful. Then cropping practices. First, let us talk about time of planting crops. We know we should plant our crops early so that we take advantage of the season. But incidentally, we have the first flush of weeds, which are highly competitive, which can affect our crop. Then we have got the second flush of weeds, which is less competitive, but can lead to delayed planting. Maybe let me try to explain this. There are some farmers who do land preparation in winter. Now, at the onset of rains, they do not really have to plow again. Or there could be farmers who do conservation agriculture. We have to plant early. On conservation agriculture and on early plowed plots, usually we get the first flush of weeds, which are highly competitive. Now, that model is going to work perfectly on these conditions. Yes, farmers should really come and remove weeds around 2 weeks, give a duration of, let's say, 2 to 6 weeks. So if they start weeding from 2 weeks after crop emergence, they should end around 6 weeks or 8 weeks after crop emergence. So under this system, where farmers are planting early, either in conservation agriculture or on early plowed plots, I think this model will work very well. But there are some farmers who wait for the first flash of weeds to emerge. Then they come in with their plow and remove the first flash of weeds. This can happen in a number of communal areas. Now, when they plant, their crop emerge with the second flash of weeds. And that second flash of weeds is less competitive. But of course, the drawback is that this can delay planting and also contribute to low yields. We had an experience in Mutoko communal area. Yes, it was Mutoko, where we wanted to demonstrate that delayed weeding could suppress yields. But because these farmers were establishing their maize crop on the second flash of weeds, meaning that they had to kill the first flash of weeds because they were aware that the first flash of weeds were highly competitive. So they would plow them, then plant. When we set our experiments in such fields, delayed weeding was not accompanied by reduced crop yields. And we were wondering what was happening. Then we found out that our experiments were imposed on the second flash of weeds. And of course, that was the practice being done by farmers, which was, I think, a good system in terms of weed control, but the penalty of delayed planting would also be great. By delaying planting, you also reduce yields. Then there's a situation which can also happen in flay areas, which we have noted in the Chiota and the Mashungo area, where you have farmers utilizing flay areas. Probably you may notice that maize planting in these areas may start around August to September. Now, when the farmers plant their seed, it could be maize seed. Now, the maize seed will be in the moisture zone, and it will be able to germinate utilizing the residual moisture and emerge. But the wheat seeds, which are very small, are embedded in the first 2 centimeters, which is very dry. These seeds, because of lack of moisture, they are not going to emerge. So the maize can actually grow without interference from the weeds, because there won't be any weeds. Unless some rains come either between August and September, which can prompt some bit of emergence. But what usually happens, most of the weeds will now emerge in November when the crop is almost reaching maturity. That is when the time the weeds may not cause an impact on the crop. So in the flay cropping systems, when we try to implement this model, it's not going to give us the true information. In fact, it can mislead us because farmers are not actually weeding during the early part of the crop life cycle because there are no weeds. And it is actually happening in Chihota and Masvingo communal area. Then the other thing on cropping practices, we have got a crop density and rectangularity, which can affect competition. We have what is called square planting. You know, by just planting in a certain way, you can actually reduce weed competition. And the square planting can reduce weed competition. So if we try to implement this model under square planting, when it says we should come and weed the sowing pattern on weed suppression and the grain yield in 3 varieties of maize under high weed pressure. This was written by Marin and Weiner. Here they were using square planting. In fact, in short, they are demonstrating that you can do away with weeding in square planting. I'll just show you some of their data. They had 3 varieties of maize. Novilero, which I have written here. There's also another, it has these 2 graphs. There's also this variety, it has these 2 graphs. This other variety, it has these 2 graphs. Now, they tested row planting and grid. Grid planting is more or less like a square planting. Now, this is weed biomass. I think this is the crop density. So it's an interaction of crop density and the planting pattern. Now with the Novilero, let us look at the grid. You can see the weeds. When we increase the crop density, we could almost reduce the weeds up to here. You know, almost to 0 weeds with the Novilero. So what it means is that if we apply this model, when we are saying come and weed at 2 weeks, this arrangement, you know, is telling us that it's not necessary to come and weed. The grid plus Novilero and this density. Of course, this depends on the varieties. You can see this variety is doing other things. You know. So you can recommend with the varieties. If you say farmers don't weed, make sure they have this variety. But here you can see weeds are actually decreasing. And of course, this variety is not good because it's not conforming to what is happening to here. So a combination of a variety, planting pattern, and density, you can actually avoid weeding. But because we do not have this information, we just have to weed. So square planting, the right density, and the right variety, you can avoid weed control. And we are saying this model, which is advising us to come and weed at 2 weeks and end at 6 weeks, under such an arrangement, it's not really necessary. So let me summarize this lecture. Where we have tried to define the concept of critical period for weed control in crops. And we said that this period, for practical purposes, is between 2 and 8 weeks after crop emergence, but this can vary. And this period is influenced by a number of factors. First, it could be period of weed seedling emergence, because the way weeds emerge will influence how that model is going to predict timing of weeding, and also its duration. Weed density can also affect the model, timing and the duration of weeding, crop density, the same thing. Weed species, because weeds have got different competitive abilities, we are saying that this is likely to affect this model. But I think we need to investigate this issue. It could be just an assumption. Then crop species and varietal effects, yes, there could be some varieties which can actually influence this model, but others may not influence this model. Soil and the climate factors, this can also influence the model. Yes, soil, we are interested in soil fertility. Poor soil fertility warrants us to come and weed area so that we conserve most of the nutrients, so that they are so that the crop may take advantage of these nutrients. Climate factors were interested in the rainfall. During droughts, the model is telling us to come and weed area, which is okay, but during wet season, we can as well delay. Soil pH, low soil pH, we have to come and weed the area. Then time of planting, if we plant the area, the model works very well. If we delay planting so that we kill the first flush of weeds, the model may not give us good information Then crop density and the rectangularity, especially square planting. We can get away without weeding, by doing square planting, right density, choosing the right variety. Then this model may not be telling us the truth. So these are the 8 factors which affect this model. But for practical purposes, the model has been found to be very useful as a weed control tool, management tool, sorry.
Maize is an important staple in northern Ghana. Major limitation to a good maize crop is weed infestation. When maize is planted, it doesn't take long before we see that not only maize is growing on the farm, but also weeds. Weeds come all sizes and types. Weeds crowd out our one space. They carry diseases and pests that harm maize and reduce yields. Some weeds send their roots into the roots of maize and rob the maize plant of its food. These type of weeds end up seriously harming the maize plant and greatly reducing yield. Weed control it is often poorly done or not done at the right time. However, weeding is for a good harvest, we have to remove weeds before they harm the maize plant. Weed your maize farm 2 to 3 times before harvest. Weeding should be done 2 to 3 weeks after germination. From this time onwards, weeding should be done any time weeds appear on the maize in substantial numbers. However, after 10 weeks, weeding can be stopped. At 10 weeks old, maize can more effectively see the best ways to control weeds. We can weed our maize farm with hoe, bullock, tractor, or with herbicide. All of these are very good and are recommended. What is critical is proper timing and appropriate operation. Also, your choice of method may depend on the farm size, the money you have, and the type of weeds you have. It needs a lot of labor. When using the hoe, weed when the soil is relatively dry to ensure that is in one season. The other kind will always be on the farm and cause problems as long as we do not kill them. The ones that appear and die in a season can easily be removed with a simple hoe or with herbicide. Those that exist throughout the year have different and require much more effort when using the hoe or the herbicide. The following herbicides are recommended for controlling weeds in a maize farm: atrazine and metolachor. Atrazine is applied 1 to 3 days after planting at 4 to 5 weeks per hectare using a knapsack spray. Use herbicide when only maize is planted on the field. When other crops contact your input dealer or agricultural extension officer before applying the herbicide. To disturb the root system of the maize plants. Remember that herbicides are poisonous. Wear protective equipment. Please read the label on each package of herbicide and follow the instructions. Do not risk your precious maize by just trying chemicals on them to see what happens. Remember the following tips when weeding. Weed at the right time. First, 2 to 3 weeks after germination, and as needed until 10 weeks. Weeding too late means maize plants may already have always remove weeds before they flower. It's crop rotation to eliminate hardy weeds. When using herbicides for the first time, be sure to seek advice from your extension officer or your agro input. Apply fertilizer carefully near your maize plants. Avoid applying too far from maize plants where the fertilizers are available for weeds to pick up and grow quickly. No method of weeding can remove all the weeds on your farm. Use herbicides to control weeds. You'll end up poisoning your farmland. If your field has weeds, remove them before applying fertilizers, or else the weeds will fertilizer from the maize and grow stronger.
Okay, that is it on the critical period for weed control. Now, I will stop here. Then we have to move on to another topic. Do you want a short break or we just continue?
I think we can continue.
Okay. Yeah, let me stop recording.